The wheel gave one final, sickening crack, and Catherine Blackwell felt the whole world tilt beneath her. Not metaphorically, not in the poetic sense that her mother had always warned her about when she spoke of men and heartbreak and the cruel mathematics of love. The right rear wheel of her wagon literally shattered against a buried rock on the Cimarron Trail, and the bed lurched so violently that Catherine had to grab the bench with both hands to keep from pitching forward into the dust. The horse, a gray mare named Pearl, screamed and stomped and nearly bolted, and for one horrible, breathless second, Catherine was certain she was going to die right there on the open Kansas plain, 60 miles from Dustfield, with no one to know her name or care about the cargo she was carrying. The cargo. God, the cargo. She scrambled down from the bench before the wagon could shift further and pressed her palm flat against Pearl's neck, murmuring the low, steady sounds that horses trusted even when humans did not. Pearl shuddered. Catherine shuddered too, but she held her face like stone because stone did not crack and she could not afford to crack right now. Not with what was hidden beneath those floorboards. The year was 1882. The trail was hot and dry and indifferent, and in the next 40 minutes, 7 different riders passed her. 7. The first was a man in a canvas duster who looked at her from beneath his hat brim, glanced at the collapsed wheel, and rode on without slowing. The second was a pair of cattle hands heading south toward Dodge, and one of them actually laughed, said something to his companion she couldn't make out, and they continued at a trot, as if a woman stranded alone on the open range was nothing more than an amusing footnote to their afternoon. The third was a merchant she recognized from Dustfield's general store, a man named Holt who had sold her flour and dried beans just 2 weeks prior, and he met her eyes, held them for a moment that felt like it contained a full accusation, and then urged his horse past her with a click of his tongue. The fourth, fifth, and sixth were strangers, which almost made it worse because at least strangers had the excuse of not knowing her. The seventh was a woman traveling alone, same as Catherine, and she slowed, genuinely slowed, and Catherine felt something flutter open in her chest like a window in a locked room. But the woman took one long look at the splintered wheel, at the angle of the wagon, at the distance remaining on the trail, and shook her head in that particular way that meant I am sorry, I truly am, but I cannot afford your trouble. And then she was gone too. Catherine stood in the long afternoon shadow of her broken wagon and faced the plain. The Cimarron Trail stretched in both directions like a sentence that refused to end. The sky above Kansas was the kind of blue that made you feel small and transparent, like something the land had agreed to tolerate temporarily. Somewhere behind those boards, beneath the false floor she had built herself with a chisel and 2 days of burning-handed labor, was a leather satchel containing $430 in cash money, 3 letters of legal consequence, and a single photograph of a man she had every reason to fear. She was not going to cry. She was absolutely not going to cry. She heard the next horse before she saw it, a slow, deliberate canter that did not have the urgency of someone with somewhere to be. She did not turn around. She had been burned too many times by the anticipation of help that then evaporated, and she had learned, if nothing else, to protect herself from the specific ache of hope disappointed. The horse slowed to a walk beside her. She still did not turn. "That wheel's done," a man's voice said. It was not a dramatic voice. It was not the voice of someone announcing themselves as heroic. It was the voice of someone stating an obvious fact with the same calm he might use to note that the sky was blue or that water ran downhill. "You have a spare," she turned then. He was sitting easy on a bay horse, a deputy star pinned to the breast of his dark vest, his hat pushed back a fraction as if he had been doing something else entirely, and had simply redirected his attention in her direction. He was not young in the reckless way that men of 20 were young, but he was not old either. 30, perhaps 32, with dark eyes that moved over the situation with the practiced assessment of someone who had learned to read scenes before reading people. His hands were resting loose on the saddle horn. He was not reaching for anything. He was not performing anything. "I do not have a spare," Catherine said. Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to. "I thought not." He swung down from the horse in one movement, landed in the dust, and walked to the broken wheel. He crouched beside it, touched the splintered wood, tilted his head. "Axle's fine, just the wheel, that's better than it could be." "I am aware it could be worse," she said. He looked up at her then. Something in his face shifted very slightly, the way a door shifts when a draft changes direction. "I didn't mean it as an insult." "No," she said. "I know you didn't." He stood up, brushed the dust from his knee, and looked down the trail in both directions. "I'm not busy," he said. It came out like an answer to a question she hadn't asked, like he had heard the long, terrible silence of the past 40 minutes and was responding to it directly. "I can ride back to Dustfield, get a wheel from the livery, and come back. Shouldn't take more than 2 hours." Catherine looked at him. She looked at the badge. She looked at his hands, which told her he was a working man, not a gentleman of leisure, not someone who used his authority like a club. She looked at the trail ahead of her and thought about the satchel under the boards and the man whose photograph was inside it and the very specific danger that man represented. "Deputy," she said carefully. "Martin Easton," he said. "Deputy Easton." She paused. "Why?" He looked at her as if the question itself was slightly surprising to him, as if he had not considered that it required a justification. "Because your wheel is broken and you're alone," he said. "That's enough of a reason." It was such a simple answer. It was the simplest answer she had heard in longer than she could properly remember. And it was precisely because it was so simple that it broke through something in her she had been holding together with careful, exhausted hands for months. She did not cry. She had promised herself she would not cry. But she said, "Thank you, Martin Easton," and her voice carried the full weight of what she meant, which was not simply thank you for the wheel. He nodded once, as if he understood all of it. Then he remounted his horse and headed back toward Dustfield at a steady pace, and Catherine Blackwell sat down in the shade of her broken wagon, wrapped her arms around her knees, and let herself breathe for the first time in what felt like months. She had arrived in Dustfield, Kansas, 6 weeks earlier, in the second week of September in the year 1882, with 2 trunks, a horse, a wagon, and a story that was technically true in all its individual parts but deeply misleading in its overall shape. The story she told was this. She was a widow from St. Louis, her husband James Blackwell having died of fever the previous spring. She was a seamstress by trade and was looking to establish herself in a town with a growing population. Dustfield had a growing population. The cattle trade kept it fed. The railroad spur brought new families west every season, and the dry goods and service economy that followed settlement meant that a skilled seamstress could find steady work without too much difficulty. All of that was true. What she did not say was that James Blackwell had not died of fever. James Blackwell had died of a bullet in a saloon fight in Wichita, 3 days before a United States Marshal arrived to arrest him for bank fraud, land theft, and the forgery of legal documents that had stripped 4 families of their homestead claims in the Oklahoma Territory. What she did not say was that the man who had fired that bullet, a man named Deacon Cole, had done so not out of righteousness, but because James Blackwell owed him money, and because Deacon Cole had a long history of collecting debts with the same methodology a butcher used on a hog. What she did not say was that Deacon Cole had then turned his attention to Catherine, who he believed, correctly, knew where James had hidden the documents and the cash from their last scheme before his death. What she did not say was that she had spent the past 4 months being followed, threatened, and driven from 2 different towns by Cole's men, and that the reason she was carrying that leather satchel under the false floor was not that she intended to use its contents for any criminal purpose, but that she was trying to get those stolen documents to a federal land office where they could be used to restore the homesteads to the families James had wronged. It was the only thing she could think of to do. It was the only amends available to her. She had chosen Dustfield because it was far enough from Wichita that Cole's reach would be stretched thin, and because the federal land office circuit judge made his rounds through Dustfield on the first Monday of every second month, which meant she had approximately 3 weeks to establish herself well enough that disappearing suddenly would not be possible without being noticed, and that someone would come looking if she did. The seamstress work had been easier to establish than she expected. The women of Dustfield were hungry for skill. She had taken a room at Mrs. Hargrove's boarding house, a large, clean establishment on the main street run by a woman of 50 who asked few questions and demanded punctuality at meals. Within 2 weeks, Catherine had 4 regular clients and a waiting list. Within 4, she had become the sort of fixture in a town that happens when a woman is competent and quiet and reliable, which is to say invisible in the way that useful things are invisible. People stopped seeing her and started expecting her. She had thought she was safe. She had started, cautiously and against her better judgment, to allow herself to think about what might come after. What a life with no James in it and no Cole chasing her might look like. Whether a woman who had made the mistakes she had made, which were mostly the mistakes of trusting the wrong person with the whole of herself, could be forgiven by the world, or at minimum by herself. And then 3 days ago she had seen one of Cole's men in the street. He was not pointing at her. He was not making any overt move. He was standing outside the saloon with a glass of beer and the studied casualness of a man who wanted to look like he had no particular purpose, and she had recognized the particular way he arranged his leisure, which was the way of a man surveilling rather than resting. She had known him from Wichita. His name was Purdy, and Purdy did not go anywhere without eventually being followed by Deacon Cole himself. She had made a decision in the space between one heartbeat and the next. She went back to the boarding house, packed only what she could carry without attracting attention, retrieved the satchel from beneath her floorboard, loaded the wagon, and left before dawn the next morning without telling Mrs. Hargrove where she was going because she genuinely did not know. She was going somewhere that was not here. That was all she had. The land office circuit judge would be in Dustfield in 18 days, and she had just run away from her only plan. That was the situation when the wheel broke. That was the situation when Martin Easton rode back to Dustfield for a spare. He returned in an hour and 40 minutes, which was faster than he had promised. He had a wheel lashed to the back of a second horse he'd brought from the livery, and he dismounted without ceremony and got to work. He had a jack and tools in his saddlebag, the kind of things a man on the trail carried if he was practical, and he worked with the methodical competence of someone who had done this kind of repair before and did not feel the need to narrate it. Catherine watched him. She could not help watching him. There was something in the way he moved, unhurried but purposeful, that her nervous system found involuntarily calming, the way a person who has been cold for a long time cannot help moving toward heat. "You're heading to Dodge?" he asked. He was on his back in the dust, working the jack beneath the axle. "I was not entirely sure where I was heading," she said. He turned his head and looked at her from underneath the wagon. "That's honest." "I try to be." He worked in silence for a moment. "Most people who leave Dustfield on the Cimarron Trail are heading to Dodge, unless they're going to Caldwell. I have no particular attachment to either." He pulled himself out from under the wagon and sat up, dusting his arms. "Something run you out of Dustfield, or did you just decide to leave?" It was not an aggressive question. It was asked the way a man asked when he had noticed something was not quite balanced and was trying to understand the weight of it. She looked at him carefully. "I had reasons," she said. "I'm not asking for them," he said. He stood, moved to the wheel, and began fitting it to the axle with practiced hands. "I'm just asking because if there's something on the trail that you're running from, I should probably know in my capacity as a deputy." She was quiet for longer than was entirely comfortable. "There's a man named Deacon Cole," she said. "He has men in Dustfield. I believe one of them arrived 3 days ago." Martin Easton's hands did not stop moving, but something in his face sharpened. "Cole," he said, "out of Wichita. You know the name." "I know the name," he said. He's wanted in Ford County on 3 different counts. There's a warrant. He tightened something on the wheel with a tool she couldn't name. What's your connection to him? This was the moment. She had navigated this moment before, in other towns, with other people, and she had always managed it by saying as little as possible. But something about Martin Easton's straightforwardness, his complete absence of performance, made her feel that a partial truth would be somehow more dishonest than the full one. "My husband," she said. "He's dead now. He and Cole had a business arrangement that was not entirely legal. Cole believes I have something that belonged to that arrangement. He's been following me for 4 months." Martin straightened and looked at her. The afternoon light was long and golden, and it caught the dust on his vest and the careful steadiness of his expression. "Do you have it?" She held his gaze. "Yes," he nodded slowly. "Is it dangerous to you to have it?" "Very." He bent back to the wheel. "All right," he said. "All right," she repeated. "I'll ride back to Dustfield with you," he said. "You can tell me as much or as little as you want, but I'll ride beside you." She opened her mouth to say something and then found she did not have the words ready. She had been alone with this for so long. She had been managing it alone for so many miles and so many sleepless nights in so many rooms that the offer of simple company felt almost incomprehensible. Not a rescue. Not a hero making promises he couldn't keep. Just a man saying he would ride beside her. "You don't know me," she said. "You don't know what you'd be riding into." He looked up at her again, and this time there was something in his eyes that was not quite a smile but was related to one. Something warm and wry and entirely without mockery. "I know your wheel was broken," he said, "and that 7 other people rode past you before they ran out of road. I know you're carrying something that scares you badly enough to leave in the dark, and I know you told me the truth when you had every reason not to." He turned back to the wheel. "That's enough to know to ride beside someone." Catherine Blackwell stood in the road on the Kansas plain and felt the whole complicated machinery of the past 4 months shift slightly on its axis. She did not say anything else. But she did not argue either. They rode back toward Dustfield as the sun went red and low over the western horizon, the kind of sunset that the plains seemed to manufacture deliberately, all that vast sky made personal by color. Martin rode a half-length to her left, close enough to be present, far enough to give her space, and the silence between them was not the silence of strangers but something slightly warmer, a silence with texture to it, like cloth rather than air. "How long have you been deputy in Dustfield?" she asked after a while, mostly because she needed something to do with the anxiety that was still crackling through her. 3 years, he said. "Before that I was with a cattle outfit out of San Antonio. Before that I was in the Army." How does a man go from the Army to cattle to lawman? He considered the question with the seriousness he seemed to give most things. The Army shows you how things break down when there's no structure. Cattle shows you how things work when everyone's moving in the same direction. Lawman is somewhere in between. She almost laughed. It came out as something quieter, a softening around her mouth that she could feel but that she hoped wasn't too visible. "That's a very tidy way to explain it. My mother always said I had a talent for organizing things." "Your mother sounds like a sensible woman." "She was," he said, and the small change in tense carried enough weight that she did not push it further. She thought about what it must be like to have the kind of quiet certainty he seemed to carry. She had grown up in St. Louis, the daughter of a printer and a woman who read everything her husband printed, and she had been educated well enough to know that intelligence and foolishness were not mutually exclusive, which was probably how she had ended up married to James Blackwell at 22, and standing here at 27 with a stolen satchel under her wagon boards and a fugitive's understanding of the map of Kansas. "I want to explain something to you," she said. "About what I'm carrying." He waited. "The documents in the satchel were used to steal land. 4 families in the Oklahoma Territory. My husband arranged the forgeries. The cash is the proceeds." She kept her voice even with considerable effort. "I have been trying to get to a federal land office to turn the documents over. I don't want the money. I want those families to have their claims restored." The silence after that was different from the silences before it. "That's why you came to Dustfield," Martin said. "The circuit judge makes rounds through Dustfield. He was due in 18 days. She paused. I left early. He'll still make his rounds," Martin said. "The judge doesn't adjust his schedule for much." She looked at him. "You're saying I should go back." "I'm saying the plan you had was a good plan," he said. "Running away from it didn't make it a bad plan, it just interrupted it." They rode for a while in silence with that sitting between them. "If I go back to Dustfield," she said, "and Cole's man is still there, then he's in a town with a sheriff's office and a deputy and a valid warrant for his employer," Martin said. "That changes the arithmetic considerably." She thought about that. She thought about Purdy's studied casualness outside the saloon and about the photograph in the satchel, which she had taken from James's desk after his death, because she had believed, even then, that the law would eventually come for her in the shape of questions about her husband's associates, and she had wanted to be able to point at a face. She thought about 4 families in the Oklahoma Territory who were currently living on land that was technically legally transferred away from them by documents she was carrying under her boots. "All right," she said. He looked at her with that near smile. "All right, I'll go back," she said, "and I'll tell you everything." So she did. For the remaining mile and a half of the road into Dustfield, with the last light turning the dusk gold around their horses' hooves, Catherine Blackwell told Martin Easton the full truth of the past year of her life. The marriage to James, which had begun with what she believed was love and had slowly revealed itself as a series of controlled revelations, each one showing her a man she recognized less. The gradual understanding that the prosperity she lived in was built on other people's ruin. The moment she realized she had become, through proximity and willful ignorance, complicit in something that could not be excused. James's death, which she had not mourned cleanly because grief and shame and relief are not emotions that behave when they are all in the same room. Cole's men appearing at her door 2 weeks after the funeral, the flight from St. Louis and then from Wichita, and then from a small town in the eastern part of Kansas whose name she had already tried to forget, and then here. Martin listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You didn't have to tell me any of that," he said. "I know. Most people in your situation wouldn't have. I know that too." He looked ahead at the lights of Dustfield appearing on the darkening horizon. "I'm going to tell the sheriff what you've told me. He'll want to hear it, and I'm going to find out if Purdy is still in town." He paused. "You should go back to Mrs. Hargrove's. If she asks where you've been, you can tell her your wheel broke on the trail, which is true." "That is true," Catherine said. "I'll come to you tomorrow morning," he said, "with information." They rode into Dustfield's main street as the oil lamps were being lit in the windows on either side, and the town did what towns did at dusk, which was contract slightly into itself, people heading for warmth and dinner and the end of the working day. Martin Easton rode with her to the boarding house and waited while she unhitched Pearl and handed her off to the stable hand. He did not dismount himself. He simply waited because that was the kind of man he appeared to be. "Deputy Easton," she said, when she had done everything that needed doing and had no more excuse to delay. "Miss Blackwell." "Catherine," she said. It came out before she'd fully decided to say it. He absorbed that with the same quiet seriousness he'd given everything else. "Catherine," he said, and then he rode toward the sheriff's office, and she went inside, and Mrs. Hargrove gave her a plate of cold supper and asked no questions at all. She did not sleep much. She lay in her narrow bed in the clean white room at Mrs. Hargrove's and listened to the sounds of Dustfield settling into night, the distant piano from the saloon, a dog somewhere, the occasional voices of men on the street below, and she thought about Martin Easton and the badge on his chest, and the way he had said "I am not busy" with the tone of a man who had simply decided to be where he was needed. She thought about the satchel, which was now hidden back in its place beneath her floorboard, restored to its position with the focused efficiency of someone who had practice. She thought about the 4 families in Oklahoma, whose names she knew from the documents. The Garrity family, The Boone family, the Tesmer family, the Walks Far family, which was a Chickasaw family whose land her husband had stolen with particular cynicism, using forged documentation to claim a section that had been held under an informal but long-standing agreement. She had read every document in that satchel. She had memorized them. They were the weight she carried that was not physical. In the morning, Martin Easton came to the boarding house at 7:30 with his hat in his hand, and a directness in his eyes that told her he had news before he opened his mouth. "Purdy left town yesterday afternoon," he said, when Mrs. Hargrove had shown him to the front parlor and given them the particular privacy of a room with a door left open just far enough for propriety. "We believe he was watching you, realized you'd left, and rode out to follow. Then he's on the Cimarron Trail," she said. "He was," Martin said. "He's in the county jail in Caldwell now. Sheriff down there picked him up on an outstanding warrant from Nebraska. Different matter entirely, but it keeps him occupied." He paused. "Cole himself is not in the area that we can determine, but with Purdy locked up and Cole's location unknown, you have a window." "The judge arrives in 15 days, she said. 14, Martin said. "He runs early sometimes." She looked at her hands, the seamstress's hands calloused from needlework, steady with the particular practice of years. "Then I have 14 days to do nothing except wait." 14 days in which Cole could arrive, Martin said. "Which is why I spoke to Sheriff Baines this morning. He's agreed to take your statement formally. If you give the statement and detail the documents you're carrying, you'll be on record with the law as a cooperative witness rather than a suspect. It changes your legal position significantly." She looked up at him. "That means putting my name on paper, in a formal statement, in a town where Cole has already sent at least one man." "It also means the law is officially on your side," he said, "instead of you being alone with a dangerous secret and no protection." She thought about this. She thought about the 7 riders who had passed her broken wagon without stopping. She thought about Martin Easton, who had stopped, who had said he was not busy, who had ridden back to Dustfield for a wheel and returned in less time than he'd promised, and who was now sitting in a boarding house parlor at 7:30 in the morning with information and a plan. "I'll give the statement," she said. Martin Easton smiled then. It was not a complicated smile. It was warm and direct, and it rearranged his whole face in a way that Catherine was not entirely prepared for, because she had become so accustomed to his carefully measured expressions that the full force of his smile was like stepping from a shaded room into sunlight. She looked away before she could say anything foolish. They went to the sheriff's office that morning, and Catherine gave a statement to Sheriff Baines, a square-built man of 50 who had the kind of face that had stopped being surprised by human behavior sometime in the previous decade. He listened, asked precise questions, wrote in a large ledger with a careful hand. When she produced 2 of the less sensitive documents from the satchel as supporting evidence, he examined them with the attention of a man who understood what he was looking at. "We'll send a telegram to the federal marshal's office in Wichita," Baines said. "Let them know you're here and cooperative. That'll formalize things on their end and put a flag on Cole's name." He sent the telegram while she waited. Martin stayed in the office, leaning against the wall near the window in a way that was ostensibly casual and actually completely watchful. She noticed that he positioned himself where he could see both the door and the street. Walking back to the boarding house afterward, she said to him, "You don't have to accompany me everywhere." "I'm not accompanying you," he said. "I'm walking in the same direction." She looked at him sideways. "That's a very convenient interpretation." "I've always found it useful," he said. She laughed then, really laughed with the full sound of it, which surprised her because she had not laughed like that in long enough that it felt like a muscle she'd forgotten she had. He looked at her with something in his expression that he pulled back before she could identify it, and they walked the rest of the way in a silence that was lighter than any silence had any right to be. The next several days established a rhythm that Catherine had not anticipated and did not entirely know what to do with. Martin Easton stopped by the boarding house each morning with information or simply with news of the day, the kind of news that told her what was happening in the town and on the surrounding trails and in the wider vicinity of threat. There was no word of Cole, no further sign of his men. The response from the federal marshal's office came on the third day. They had a warrant for Cole on charges connected to James's fraud, and they were actively looking for him. A deputy marshal would pass through Dustfield before the circuit judge arrived. Catherine's cooperation was noted and appreciated. She was not considered a suspect. She read that last line 3 times. She had not known until she read it how heavily she had been carrying the fear of it. She worked. She sewed. She completed a dress for the wife of the land surveyor, a complicated construction of blue broadcloth with cut steel buttons that the woman had been waiting on for 2 weeks, and received payment that made Mrs. Hargrove's next month of rent feel considerably less fraught. She took in 2 more clients. She repaired a cavalry officer's uniform for the dry goods merchant to pass along. She rebuilt the kind of ordinary life that ordinary days were made of, and it steadied her in the same way that the rhythms of ordinary work always had. But the new thing, the thing she had not expected, was Martin. He did not make declarations. He was not that kind of man. He did not bring her flowers or recite poetry, or employ any of the formal machinery of courtship as she had observed it in St. Louis, where men pursued women with the systematic approach of someone executing a commercial transaction. Martin simply appeared. He appeared in the morning with news and in the evening sometimes on the street when she came back from a client's house, and once when she was struggling to carry bolts of fabric she had ordered from the general store, he was simply there, taking the heavier ones without being asked and walking beside her without treating it as a large gesture. He asked her questions about her life with a genuine curiosity that was not interrogative. He told her things about himself with the same evenness, not performing intimacy, but simply making room for it, like a man who knows that trust is built incrementally and is patient with the process. She found herself thinking about him when he was not there, which was the particular kind of evidence she had learned to take seriously, because it was usually the least deceitful form of information her own mind produced. On the 6th day, she asked him directly. They were sitting on the bench outside the boarding house in the late afternoon, which was a thing that happened when the weather was fine and the evening had not yet committed to itself. The street was active with the end-of-day movement of the town, horses and wagons and men in boots and women in bonnets, all of it ordinary and alive. "Martin," she said, "Catherine, why have you been checking on me every day?" He was quiet for a moment in the way that told her he was choosing words rather than avoiding the question. "Because I find myself wanting to," he said, "and because it happens to align with my professional responsibilities, which is a convenient coincidence." She looked at him. "Which part comes first, the wanting to or the professional responsibility?" "The wanting to," he said. He said it without hesitation and with the specific quality of a man who had decided not to pretend otherwise. The silence after that was the warmest silence she had sat inside in longer than she could measure. "I should tell you something," she said. "All right." "I came to Dustfield with a specific, limited purpose. When that purpose is accomplished, I had not made any plan beyond it." She paused. "I had not let myself make any plan beyond it because I didn't know if there would be a beyond it." He turned slightly on the bench to look at her, and she felt the attention of his eyes with a fullness she was not accustomed to. "And now," he said, "now I find myself thinking about plans," she said, "which is either a good sign or very poor judgment." "It could be both," he said. "It could be," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment, then, "I was married 3 years ago. She died in childbirth, the child as well." He said it with the evenness of a man who has held something very heavy for long enough that he has found a way to carry it without it showing constantly in his face, but the weight of it was audible. "I'm not telling you so you'll feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because you told me the full truth of your situation when you didn't have to, and I think you deserve the same." Catherine felt something deep and private, and aching open in her chest. She did not reach for him because that was not what this moment asked for. She simply said, "I'm very sorry, Martin." "I know," he said, and somehow those two words between them were as full as a long conversation. They sat together until the street lamps were lit, and then she went inside, and he walked back toward the sheriff's office, and she stood at her window for a long time after watching the street. On the 9th day, a rider arrived in Dustfield that Catherine did not recognize, but that Sheriff Baines identified immediately as one of Cole's men. He was different from Purdy, younger, leaner, with the particularly focused quality of someone who had been sent to accomplish something specific rather than to observe. Baines arrested him on the federal warrant before he'd been in town an hour, which was efficient and satisfying, but it also meant that Cole knew where she was. Cole had sent this man knowing roughly what the destination was, which meant Cole was not far. Martin told her this that evening with the directness she had come to expect from him, and with it a proposal that was practical and entirely professional in its framing. "I'd like you to move the satchel," he said. "Not to a different hiding place on your person, but to the sheriff's office. It'll be logged as evidence and held under Baines's custody. That removes it from your possession entirely, which removes the primary reason Cole has to threaten you directly." She had been holding that satchel for 4 months. She had slept with it under her floorboard and traveled with it beneath her feet and carried the weight of it in her dreams. The idea of surrendering it was not simple, but she thought about the Garrity family, the Boone family, the Tesmer family, the Walks-Farr family. "Yes," she said, "let's do that." They went to the sheriff's office that night. She produced the satchel from beneath the floorboard with a steadiness that cost her something, and Martin and Baines received it with the formal gravity of men taking custody of something important. Baines catalogued every document and every bill of currency in the lamplight while Catherine watched, and Martin stood at her shoulder with the solid, quiet presence she had come to trust without quite deciding to. When it was done, she felt lighter in a way that was physical, as if something she had been braced against had been removed. Outside the office, in the cool night air of the Dustfield street, she stopped walking and turned to look at Martin. He was looking at her already. "When this is over," she said, "when the judge has come and the documents are filed and the whole terrible business is concluded," she stopped, because the sentence had several different endings and she was not sure which one to use. "Yes," he said. "I don't know where I'll go," she said. "I've been moving for 4 months and I'm very tired of moving." "Dustfield is a growing town," he said, "and nothing else." But his eyes were doing that thing where they held more than the words, and she had learned to read that. "I know it is," she said. They stood in the street in the dark for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. And then Martin said, "Let me walk you back," and she said, "All right." And they walked back to the boarding house side by side in the cool Kansas night. And when they reached the door, she turned to say good night and found him looking at her with an expression that was so unguarded that it felt like something he had stopped protecting just for a moment, just long enough for her to see it clearly. And what she saw in it was everything she had been cautiously not naming for 9 days. "Martin," she said quietly. "I know," he said, "just that, I know." And it was the most complete sentence she had heard in a very long time. She went inside. She pressed her back against the closed door in the dark hallway and held the fullness of that moment carefully, the way you hold something fragile before you know for certain how strong it is. Deacon Cole arrived on the 11th day. He was not subtle about it. Cole had apparently concluded that subtlety was a wasted resource at this stage, and had simply ridden into Dustfield at noon on a Tuesday with 2 men beside him, and the bearing of someone who believed that arrival was the same as authority. He was a large man, well dressed for the frontier in the way that men who wanted to be seen as powerful sometimes were, with a dark coat and a silver watch chain and eyes that had the cold flatness of someone who had organized his entire world around the premise that other people were instruments. Catherine saw him from the window of the dress shop where she was fitting a client. She recognized him from the photograph in the satchel, and for a moment every hair on her body stood up. Then she thought, the satchel is not here, it is in Baines's custody. Cole can threaten me all he wants. He cannot take what is not in my possession." She finished the fitting with steady hands that she was proud of, excused herself, and walked directly to the sheriff's office. Martin was already there. He had apparently seen Cole's arrival and formed a similar assessment, because he was standing in the office with his hat on, and his expression arranged in the particular configuration of a man who had decided how he was going to handle a thing before the thing had quite finished presenting itself. "He's here," she said. "He's here," Martin agreed. "Baines is meeting him now. The federal marshal's deputy arrived this morning on the early stage. He's the one with the formal warrant." "I know," she said. "I saw him this morning." Martin looked at her. "How are you?" It was such a simple question, but the way he asked it, the specific weight of concern behind it, the sense that he was asking about the whole of her and not just the tactical situation, made her have to hold herself very deliberately together. "I am frightened," she said, because she had decided that she was going to be honest with this man as a matter of principle. "I have been frightened of that man for 4 months, and I am still frightened of him, even though logically I understand that his power over me has been substantially reduced by the events of the last 11 days. Logically and actually are different things," Martin said. "Yes." He moved to stand beside her, not between her and the door as a protector might, but beside her as a companion would, and he said, "Whatever happens in the next few hours, you've already done what needed doing. Those documents are in Baines's custody. Your statement is on record. The federal warrant is active. Cole can bluster all he wants, but you've already won the thing that mattered." She looked at him. "You make it sound very straightforward." "It is straightforward," he said. "That doesn't mean it wasn't hard to get here." She heard voices outside. Through the window she could see the street, Cole's 2 men waiting with the horses, Cole himself presumably somewhere nearby with Baines and the federal deputy. She could see a small gathering of townspeople doing the particular casual observation that small western towns performed when something official and potentially dangerous was happening. "Martin," she said. "I'm here," he said. And that was all, "I'm here." 2 words that she had not had from anyone in 4 months. 2 words that constituted a whole grammar of safety. And she stood with them for a moment before the door opened, and Sheriff Baines came in with the federal deputy marshal, and the whole formal machinery of the law rolled forward. Cole was arrested on the street 20 minutes later. The federal warrant covered 3 counts of extortion and 2 of accessory to fraud. His 2 men were detained on lesser charges. It was not dramatic in the way that the penny papers made frontier law dramatic. No gunplay, no shouting, just the cold, structural application of legal authority in the shape of papers and handcuffs and men who had been given the right to say, "You are coming with us." Cole said several things that Catherine could hear faintly from inside the office, none of them constructive, and then the sound of his voice was replaced by the ordinary sounds of the town resuming its business. She sat in a chair in the sheriff's office and breathed. Martin came back inside and leaned against the wall and looked at her with that expression that was by now completely familiar to her, the one that held more than it showed. "Done?" she asked. "He'll be held for transport to Wichita," Martin said. "The federal deputy will take him day after tomorrow." He paused. "Purdy is still in Caldwell. The man we arrested 3 days ago will go with Cole." She nodded. She nodded several times more than the occasion strictly required, because her head was full of a buzzing, weightless sensation that she thought might be relief, but felt too large for that word. "Catherine," Martin said quietly. She looked up. "Are you all right?" She laughed, which was not the sound she expected to produce. It came out with tears behind it, the laughing and crying combination that represented the dissolution of sustained strain, and she pressed her fingers to her mouth and said, "I think I am." And he crossed the room and sat in the chair beside hers and put his hand over hers where it rested on her knee, and she let him. They stayed like that for a while, in the quiet of the sheriff's office with the afternoon light coming through the dusty window, and it was the most at peace Catherine Blackwell had felt in longer than she could accurately account for. The circuit judge arrived on the 13th day, a day early, as Martin had warned was possible. His name was Archibald Foss, and he was a lean man of 60 with spectacles and a reputation for precision that preceded him like a well-calibrated warning. He reviewed Catherine's statement, examined the documents in Baines's custody, questioned her for 2 hours with the focused specificity of a man who had been doing this work for decades, and had organized his skepticism into a series of exactly the right questions. At the end of the 2 hours, he said, "The documentation is sufficient to restore the 4 homestead claims. The legal process will take some months to complete, but the outcome is not in doubt." Catherine heard the words and sat with them for a moment. 4 families in the Oklahoma Territory, whose land would be returned to them. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "Don't thank me," Foss said. "The law did what the law is supposed to do. It doesn't always, but today it did." He gathered his papers. "You'll be called as a witness in the cold trial, Miss Blackwell. But that's some time away, and your statement and presence here today has established your standing as a cooperative witness. You won't have any difficulties." She nodded. She was still very quiet. Martin was waiting outside the judge's temporary office when she emerged, and she stopped when she saw him and was not able to quite organize her face into the composed expression she would have preferred to present. "Well," he said. "It's done," she said. "The claims will be restored." He looked at her for a moment with something that was not quite an expression she had a name for, but that she knew she would remember precisely for the rest of her life. And then he said, "You did that. You carried those documents for 4 months through 2 states and 6 counties, and you got them to the right people. You did that." She tried to say something and found she couldn't. He stepped forward and she stepped forward, and then she was crying in earnest, with her face against his chest and his hand on her back with the steady, careful pressure of someone who understood that sometimes a person needs to be held without being managed. And she cried out 4 months of terror and exhaustion and shame and grief, and the particular ache of being alone with something too large to carry alone. And he let her, and the main street of Dustfield, Kansas, in the year 1882, went about its ordinary business around them. The weeks that followed were the most ordinary weeks Catherine had known since before her marriage. Ordinary in the way that recovery is ordinary, that is to say, full of small victories that accumulated like interest. She continued her seamstress work. She expanded her client list and began to think seriously about whether she could afford a proper shop rather than working from Mrs. Hargrove's parlor. She wrote 3 letters, one to the Garrity family, one to the Boone family, and one to the Tesmer family, explaining as clearly and briefly as she could that the documentation affecting their claims had been submitted to a federal court, and that their homesteads would be restored to them. She did not know how to write to the Walks Farr family because she did not know enough about the particular geography of their situation or the most effective form of address, and she sat with the inadequacy of that for some time before asking Judge Foss's clerk, who was still in Dustfield processing papers, if he could direct an appropriate notification through the proper channels. He agreed that he could. She and Martin Easton walked together in the evenings. That was the most precise description of what was happening between them, and she preferred precise descriptions because they did not build up to disappointments the way vague ones did. They walked. They talked. They had discovered, independently and then together, that they were both people who had read considerably more than was entirely typical for the frontier, and this produced a kind of conversation that was not available to either of them elsewhere in Dustfield, a conversation with range to it, that could move from the specific and practical to the philosophical, and then back again without losing its thread. He had her come to the small house he kept on the edge of town for dinner one Sunday, which he cooked himself with the same methodical competence he brought to wheel repairs and law enforcement, a roasted chicken and cornbread, and a dried apple cake that was better than it had any right to be. She brought a jar of the strawberry preserves she had made from the late-season fruit Mrs. Hargrove had from the market, and they sat at his plain wooden table in his plain wooden house and ate and talked, and she thought about how the particular plainness of his life had a quality she found beautiful. The quality of a life lived deliberately without excess, chosen rather than simply accumulated. After dinner, she helped him wash the dishes at the pump, which was an entirely domestic act that carried the weight of a declaration, and they stood in the kitchen in the amber light of the oil lamp with the quiet settling into something more specific than ordinary quiet. And Martin said, "Catherine," in the tone of a man who has been building toward a sentence for some time and has finally arrived at the start of it. "Yes," she said. He turned from the dishpan and looked at her directly with those dark eyes that she had been reading for weeks and reading well. "I know this started with a broken wheel on the Cimarron Trail," he said. "I know the circumstances were not conventional." "They were not," she agreed. "And I know you've had a year of your life that was defined by being attached to someone who did not deserve your attachment, which means the last thing you need is anyone making claims on you before you've had time to find your feet in your own life." He was speaking carefully, with the precision she had come to love, the precision of a man who respected language enough to use it correctly. "But I also know what I feel, and I think I would rather tell you plainly than let the not saying of it get in between us." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved across the Kansas plain with its constant, even sound. "Tell me," she said. "I love you," Martin Easton said. He said it the way he said most things, without embellishment, without performance, with the full weight of a man who means exactly what he says and has made sure he means it before he says it. "I have been falling in love with you since you stood in the road next to your broken wagon and told me the complete truth when you had no reason to. And I don't want to push you toward anything you're not ready for, but I wanted you to know." Catherine Blackwell looked at Martin Easton across the narrow kitchen of his plain house on the edge of Dustfield, Kansas, and felt the ground under her feet become something more reliable than it had been in years. "I love you too," she said. "I've been trying very hard not to because I've made terrible decisions about love before and I was afraid of making another one." She paused. "But I've been paying close attention to you for 6 weeks now, and everything I've observed has led me to the same conclusion, and I trust what I observe." He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and cupped her face in his hands, and she put her hands over his, and then he kissed her with the same quality he had in everything, steady and certain, and without any performance whatsoever, and she kissed him back with the full force of a woman who had been cautious for a very long time and had finally found something worth being incautious about. When they broke apart, she was laughing and he was smiling, and she leaned her forehead against his and said, "What do we do now?" "I'd like to court you properly," he said, "in the traditional way, with Sunday dinners and walks and the general knowledge of the town." "The town already knows," she said. "I promise you Mrs. Hargrove has been fully aware of the situation for at least 3 weeks." He laughed then, a full, warm sound that she felt in her chest. "I suppose I shouldn't be surprised. Small towns have a very efficient information network," Catherine said. "It's one of their more useful qualities." He kissed her again, briefly, and then they went back to the dishes because the dishes still needed doing, and they stood at the pump in the lamplight and finished them together, and it was the best evening she had had in years. They courted in the way that Martin had proposed, which was to say openly, and with the particular dignity that both of them, for different reasons, believed that love deserved. The town of Dustfield absorbed this information with the equanimity of a community that has seen enough human behavior to not be easily scandalized, and the reaction was largely positive, because Catherine had established herself as hardworking and honest, and the deputy was well regarded, and people generally approve of competent individuals finding each other. There were 3 months of courtship that were among the most detailed, most examined, most genuinely known 3 months of Catherine's life. She and Martin talked about everything that could be talked about his years in the army and the things he had seen there and what he made of them, about her childhood in St. Louis and the bookshop around the corner from her father's print shop where she had spent so many hours, about what had drawn them each to their particular skills, him to law and her to the needle, about what they believed about the world and about people, and about what it meant to try to do right in a landscape that was not always amenable to right being done. She told him things she had not told anyone about her marriage. Not the facts which she had already told him, but the interior experience of it, the slow erosion of a self that happens when you are with someone who requires you to be smaller than you are, and the shame of having let it happen, and the longer, harder work of understanding that shame was not the right response to being deceived. He listened with the completeness she had come to rely on. He did not try to fix it or minimize it. He simply held it with her. He told her things about his wife, Hannah, who had been kind and funny, and who had loved horses with a particular devotion that still made him smile when he thought of it. He told her about the grief of that loss, which was the kind of grief that doesn't resolve but that changes, that learns to exist alongside the ordinary business of living rather than consuming it. She listened with the same completeness he gave to everything she said. They were good at this, at listening. At the specific attention that genuine love requires, which is not the attention of admiration or desire, though those were present too, but the attention of wanting to know, of finding the other person continuously interesting, of caring about the interior life and not only the surface of them. In December, 4 months after the broken wheel and 3 months into their courtship, Martin asked Catherine Blackwell to marry him. He did it on a Sunday afternoon in the kitchen of his house, where they had established the habit of cooking together on Sunday afternoons, which was the most domestically intimate thing either of them had ever done with another person, and which they both found profoundly satisfying. She was making biscuit dough and he was dealing with a pot of beans, and he said, without turning from the stove, "I would like to marry you, Catherine." She looked at the back of his head. "Would you?" "Very much," he said. He still hadn't turned. "If you want to. And if you don't, I'd rather know now than later." She set down the dough and wiped her hands on her apron and said, "Martin Easton, turn around." He turned around. She looked at him, this careful and honest man with his plain house and his deputy's badge, and his way of saying exactly what he meant without adornment. She thought about everything she had come to know of him in 4 months, and everything she wanted to keep learning for however many months and years came next. She thought about the broken wheel on the Cimarron Trail, and the afternoon light turning gold and the sound of his voice saying, "I am not busy." "Yes," she said, "I want to marry you." He crossed the kitchen and kissed her with the warmth of a man who had hoped for this answer, but had been genuinely prepared for another one. And she kissed him back with the certainty of a woman who had learned, through considerable hardship, to know her own mind. They were married in March of 1883, in the spring when the Kansas plain was doing its brief, spectacular thing with wildflowers and new grass. The ceremony was performed by the Methodist minister, a gentle man named Reverend Thacker, in the presence of Mrs. Hargrove and her husband, Sheriff Baines and his wife, and roughly a third of Dustfield's population, because small towns do not pass up a wedding, and because both Catherine and Martin had, in their different ways, become fixtures in Dustfield's daily life. Catherine wore a dress she had made herself, which was a significant and deliberate choice. It was ivory broadcloth with a high collar and long sleeves and small pearl buttons down the back that she had to ask Mrs. Hargrove to fasten. And it was the most beautiful thing she had ever made, and the most beautiful thing she had ever worn, and she wore it with the particular joy of a woman who has built the thing herself. Martin waited for her at the front of the church with a new vest and clean boots and the expression of a man who had decided, entirely and without reservation, to be happy about where his life had brought him. When she reached him and he took her hand, he leaned slightly and said, very quietly for only her, "You are the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." She looked at him with her eyes full and her heart so large she was not entirely sure it would fit properly inside her chest, and she said, "You are the most honest man I have ever known. which was everything she meant and more. They said their vows with the clarity of two people who understood what they were promising because they had talked about it at length and were not making assumptions about each other's meaning. The congregation was attentive and warm. Mrs. Hargrove wept in the way of a woman who finds weddings satisfying at a deep structural level. Baines shook Martin's hand afterward with the grip of a man who means his congratulations. There was a celebration at the saloon's back room, which had been designated for the occasion by the owner's wife, who had decided that a proper wedding reception was good for civic morale and had arranged it accordingly. There was music from the piano, and food, and a great deal of conversation, and Martin danced with Catherine with the focused pleasure of a man dancing with his wife for the first time, and she danced with him with the full attention she gave to everything that mattered. Later, when the celebration had wound down and the town had retreated into its evening, they walked together to the house on the edge of Dustfield, which was now both of theirs, and Catherine stood in the small kitchen and looked at the plain walls and the plain table and the oil lamp making its amber circle, and she thought, "This is mine. This is what after looks like." And it was nothing like what she had expected, because she had been too afraid to expect anything specific, and it was better than she could have invented because it was real. They were happy. It is important to say this plainly and without qualification. They were happy together. Not in the uncomplicated way of people who have never been tested, but in the more durable way of people who have been tested and have found each other on the other side of it. Martin was steadier than anyone Catherine had known. Not passive, not without opinion or feeling, but fundamentally steady, with the kind of character that does not shift according to what it's convenient to be. She found, to her considerable relief, that she trusted him not because she had decided to, but because she had observed him long enough and carefully enough that trust was the only reasonable conclusion. He found, in her, a mind that matched his in its range and its seriousness, and a humor that surprised him regularly, and a capacity for loyalty that he thought was the deepest thing he had ever encountered in another person. He had been alone with his grief and his work for 3 years before Catherine, and he had not known, quite, how alone that was until the contrast showed him. In September of 1883, 6 months into their marriage, Catherine told Martin she was expecting their first child. She told him in the kitchen, which had become the room in their life where the important things happened, and he set down his coffee cup and looked at her with an expression that moved through several registers in quick succession before settling on a joy so undisguised it made her eyes fill. "Catherine," he said. "I know," she said. He came to her and held her carefully, with the particular care of a man who has lost a child before, and whose love for the woman in his arms is the whole of what keeps him anchored, and she held him back just as carefully, because she understood what this meant to him, and she did not take that understanding lightly. There was fear underneath the joy. It would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. Martin's first wife had died in childbirth, and that knowledge lived in the space between them without either of them having to name it. Catherine had read enough to know the risks and to have decided, deliberately, that she was going to live her life rather than be managed by its possible losses, but knowing and not fearing were different things. She had a good pregnancy. She was healthy, and the winter of 1883 into 1884 was not the brutal season the plains sometimes produced. And Mrs. Hargrove, who had 3 grown children and the practical knowledge that produced, appointed herself a kind of unofficial advisor and appeared regularly with suggestions that were occasionally unnecessary but always kindly meant. The doctor, whose name was Hayward, and who was the kind of frontier physician who had seen enough to know what he could and could not manage, pronounced her constitution sound and her progress unremarkable in the best possible sense. Their son was born in April of 1884, which was another spring of wildflowers and new grass, as if the plain had decided to establish a pattern. Martin was present for all of it in the way that was not universally customary but that he had insisted upon, and when the child arrived, red and furious and entirely, magnificently alive. Martin held him with an expression that Catherine would describe to herself for the rest of her life as the most complete thing she had ever seen on a human face. It was joy and relief and grief acknowledged and finally released, all at once, in the face of a man holding his living son. They named him Thomas James Easton, Thomas for Martin's father. James, after considerable discussion, not for Catherine's husband but for the name itself, which she had always associated with her own father's best friend, a printer's assistant who had been the most consistently kind man in her childhood. She had reclaimed it. Martin understood immediately what she was doing with it and said the name felt right. Thomas was an earnest baby who grew into a cheerful, curious child with his father's dark eyes and his mother's exacting attention to how things were made. He was the kind of child who wanted to understand the mechanism of everything, which made him simultaneously delightful and exhausting, and both Catherine and Martin adored him unreservedly. In 1886, their daughter arrived. They named her Eleanor for no one in particular but because both of them, independently and then together, thought the name had a quality of permanence to it, which felt appropriate. Eleanor was born in summer and was, from her very first weeks, a person of considerable personality, which expressed itself primarily in strong opinions about what she did and did not want, which Catherine found privately hilarious, and which Martin navigated with the same steady patience he brought to most things. The family grew into itself the way families do when they are built on foundations that are actually sound, gradually and without drama, each year adding a new layer of ordinary life that made the whole thing more real and more theirs. Martin was promoted to town marshal of Dustfield in 1885, when Baines retired to a farm 40 miles east, and the town council unanimously selected his deputy to succeed him. Catherine was in the front row of the town hall meeting when they announced it, and she watched her husband receive the news with the particular combination of genuine humility and quiet satisfaction that characterized the way he received most good things, as if he was grateful but not surprised, because he had worked for it and that work had consequences. She had, by then, opened her seamstress shop. It was a small storefront on the main street, 2 rooms, one for fitting and display and one for work, with a sign that said Blackwell Sewing, because she had decided to keep her birth name professionally, partly for practical reasons of the client list she had built under it, and partly because it was the name she had carried through fire, and she was not inclined to discard it simply because her circumstances had changed. Martin had supported this without a moment's hesitation, which told her everything she needed to know about the kind of husband he was. The years between 1885 and 1888 were the years of establishing, of becoming something in a place, of putting down roots that went deep enough to mean something. Catherine became one of the most respected women in Dustfield, known for her work and her directness and her particular willingness to say what she thought in the town meetings that she attended with Martin, and where she was, eventually, one of the voices that shaped decisions. The territory was changing around them. Oklahoma was opening further to settlement, which brought complicated feelings, because Catherine knew better than most how that settlement had been managed in the past and what it had cost people. She stayed engaged with those questions. She donated a portion of her shop's income to the fund that the Federal Land Office had established to assist displaced families in the territory, and she talked about why in a way that was clear-eyed and not self-congratulatory, because she understood that her contribution was part of a longer attempt at reparation that would outlast her. The Walks Farr family had, she learned through the federal courts process, successfully had their land claim restored in 1884. She received a formal notification from the circuit court's office and read it in her shop with the door closed and cried in private for several minutes before going home and telling Martin, who held her in the kitchen in the way he had learned to hold her when the feelings were too large for the room. In 1888, they had a second son. They named him Robert, after a book character they had both loved independently and discovered they shared a few weeks before he was born, which seemed like a reasonable argument for the name. Robert was born healthy and round, and with an expression of such philosophical calm that the doctor said he had never seen a baby arrive so prepared for existence. Martin said he thought Robert took after Catherine, which made her laugh and press her face against his chest. Thomas was 4 and Eleanor was 2 when Robert arrived, and the house on the edge of Dustfield, which Martin had expanded twice in the intervening years, became the full and complicated thing that a house with 3 children becomes, loud and warm, and perpetually in the process of something being built or broken or discovered. Catherine sometimes stood in the kitchen in the early morning before the children woke and Martin was already at the marshal's office, and the town was just beginning its day, and she thought about the broken wheel on the Cimarron Trail. She thought about the 7 riders who had passed her without stopping. She thought about the way the afternoon had felt, alone on the plain with no one coming and everything in the balance, and the sound of a horse slowing behind her, and a voice that said, "Your wheel is done. Do you have a spare?" in the particular tone of someone who had simply decided to be present for whatever was needed. She thought about how close it had come to going differently, if Martin had not been on that road, if he had been busy. If she had been on any other road on any other day, and he had been anywhere else. The slenderness of the thread that the whole of the life she was now living had hung from made her hold her coffee cup a little more carefully and feel the warmth of the house around her with a fullness that was close to reverence. She did not, fundamentally, believe that things were destined to work out. She had seen too much of the world's indifference to believe in destiny with any reliability. But she believed in the choices that had been made, step by step, by 2 people who had decided to be honest with each other and patient with each other, and present with each other in a world that offered plenty of reasons to be otherwise. She believed in those choices the way she believed in the work of her own hands, because both were the things she could actually see the evidence of. In 1889, Oklahoma Territory opened formally to white settlement in the Great Oklahoma Land Rush, and Catherine watched from Dustfield as the complicated and often unjust machinery of that event played out in the news that arrived by telegraph and by the accounts of people passing through. She had by then been corresponding for 3 years with a woman named Clara Tesmer, daughter of the family whose land claim had been restored, and Clara's letters described the territory with the detail of someone who lived there and loved it, and was also under no illusions about what it had cost. Catherine kept those letters in a wooden box in her shop desk and answered them carefully, because she understood that the correspondence was one of the ways she could keep herself accountable to the larger story she was part of. Martin read the letters too when she shared them, and he and Catherine talked about the questions they raised with the same honesty and range they brought to every conversation that mattered. He was not a man who simplified what was complicated, and she had never needed him to be. Their life in Dustfield continued with the particular texture of a life built by people who valued what they had built. The shop grew. The marshal's office became a point of stability in a town that was growing fast enough to need it. Thomas grew into a serious boy of 8 who had decided he wanted to become a builder and spent his weekends constructing elaborate structures from scrap wood in the yard. Eleanor at 6 was a small, fierce person with opinions about everything and a laugh that could be heard 3 houses away. Robert at 2 was still philosophical, watching the world with those calm eyes as if he were taking notes. In the summer of 1890, Catherine discovered she was expecting again. She was 35 years old, which she was aware of, and she told Martin with a mixture of joy and honest acknowledgement of what age meant, and he received it with the same joy and honest acknowledgement and the specific love of a man who had not assumed that the future was infinite and therefore valued every piece of it. Their second daughter was born that winter. They named her Grace, because Catherine had decided she was allowed to name a child for a quality rather than a person, And because grace was the thing she had been trying to practice in herself for years, the quality of moving through the world without bitterness, of letting the hard things be hard without letting them become the whole story. Grace arrived in December, and Martin held her in the lamplight of the bedroom while the snow fell outside, and Thomas and Alina and Robert pressed their faces against the doorframe to see their new sister, and Catherine lay in the bed, exhausted and entirely content, and thought, "This is the life, not the life I expected, not the life I would have designed, but the life that came from a broken wheel on a September afternoon in 1882, from the honesty of two people who chose each other deliberately and kept choosing each other, from the slow and real work of building something true." By 1892, Catherine Blackwell Easton was 40 years old, and she would tell you, if you asked her in the direct way that she preferred to be asked, that the decades of her life had divided themselves into two unequal parts. The first part, which ran through her marriage to James and the difficult years after, had been defined by the experience of being shaped by forces outside herself, by a man who required her smallness, and a situation that required her concealment, and a fear that required her movement. The second part had been defined by something different and much more sustaining, the experience of being known by someone, fully and without edit, and found not just acceptable but loved. She sometimes thought about what she would say to a woman standing by a broken wagon on the Cimarron Trail, carrying a secret too large to carry, watching rider after rider pass without stopping. She thought she would say, "The help will come, not in the form you expected, not in the form you would have designed, but in the form of a man on a bay horse with a deputy's badge who says he is not busy and means it down to the bone. The help will come, and it will lead somewhere you could not have mapped from where you're standing. Hold on until it does." Martin came home on a Thursday evening in October of that year to find Catherine in the kitchen making apple preserves, the fall harvest having been generous, with all 4 children distributed around the house in their various pursuits, Thomas reading something about bridge construction, Alina drawing at the table, Robert in the yard with a stick he had decided was a horse, and Grace asleep on a folded quilt in the corner of the kitchen, round and warm and entirely at peace with existence. He came through the door and stopped for a moment the way he sometimes did, standing in the threshold of the kitchen with the evening light behind him and his hat in his hand, and Catherine looked up from the pot and met his eyes across the room. She had been looking into those eyes for 10 years. She knew them as well as she knew her own hands, which was to say completely, every variation of expression, every particular quality of light they held when he was happy or concerned or thoughtful or moved. She knew them and found them continuously interesting, which was the thing she had discovered was the deepest sign of love, not that the feeling was unchanging but that the person remained interesting, remained worth knowing, remained someone you chose again with the information of all the previous days behind you. "How was it?" she asked. "Quiet day," he said. He set his hat on the peg and crossed the kitchen and kissed her, tasting of dust and the autumn air, and she leaned up into it with the ease of 10 years of practice. He looked at the preserves and then at the sleeping Grace and then at her. "What can I do?" "There are potatoes," she said. "I can do potatoes," he said. He took off his vest and hung it over the chair back and rolled up his sleeves and took up the potatoes, and they worked in the kitchen together in the lamplight, while the children moved through the house in the ordinary business of their lives, and the smell of apple preserves filled the kitchen with the particular sweetness of autumn, and the wind came off the Kansas plain with its constant, even voice, and Catherine Blackwell Easton stood at the stove and felt the warm, steady presence of her husband beside her and the sounds of her children around her and the full, complex, earned weight of the life she was living, and she thought, as she had thought many times in 10 years but never, with diminished feeling, this is what after looks like. This is what you get when the right person stops on the right road and says he is not busy. She reached over and put her hand briefly over his where it held the knife, and he looked up at her with that expression that had never once in 10 years run out of warmth. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Just wanted to." He turned his hand over and squeezed hers once, and then went back to the potatoes, and she went back to the preserves, and the kitchen filled with warmth, and the evening came down over Dustfield, Kansas, in the autumn of 1892, and it was good. It was thoroughly, durably, irreversibly good.